I am now going to continue my Black Sabbath series with On Music. Um, I don't know if I'm happy with that title, On Music, but it's okay because that's what I'm talking about. I'm expounding on music. So, anyway, today I am going to continue where I left off with the amazing Eternal Idol album and how I got drawn into it and my feelings about it, etc. And then we're going to move forward. If we're lucky, we'll get to the 1992 reunion. So, 1987, I knew an album was coming out. I knew that Ray Gillen was going to be singing, and then at the last minute, they said he was out of the band, and his vocal parts were recorded by a guy named Tony Cat Martin. I heard this on a show called Metal Shop, which was on the WROQ Rock Radio that I've mentioned in some of my previous installments. But by that time, my infatuation with and dependency on WRQ was seriously waning. I was about to put radio pretty much behind me. Uh, well, I pretty much had put radio for the most part behind me. I rarely ever listened to it by that time. Um, and that station had gotten a lot more mainstream and just kind of repetitive classic rock over and over. You knew the same songs you were going to hear every day. Didn't have the sense of adventure in the early 80s that it did in the early 80s. Um, but anyway, as far as the album went, I went one day. I was going to school at a place called Central Piedmont Community College here in town, and I had a classmate named Brent, and Brent was going to give me a lift home and to see my then girlfriend, and who was working at the grocery store I used to work at that I've mentioned before. By that time, I was no longer working at that grocery store. I don't think I was even. Yeah, I was. I was working at a different store, but not at that particular one that was near Ernie's Records. But on the way to visit Alicia at the grocery store, um, we dropped by the School Kids Records, which was on a parallel street, and I used to go there quite a bit by myself afternoons after work at Harris Teeter. I used to go there quite a bit with on Friday evenings with my friend JJ. I told you about in my first on music about how we went there one evening and this guy, aggressively converted me to Motorhead. Um, so yeah, it was a fun place to hang out. There was also one across town that my friend Vincent and I went to a time or two, which maybe because of the locale or whatever, it kind of emphasized a little more of the R&B, soul, funk, reggae side of things. Whereas my school kids was a lot of it was the alternative rock, the death rock, the prog rock, the metal, and the classic rock. Those were kind of the. It was a rock kind of thing. There wasn't a whole lot of um, music there that wasn't rock oriented. But it wasn't a used record store either. It was an all new record store. So having all that new vinyl and cassettes, much more vinyl than cassettes, um, they had to kind of be choosy about, I guess, what or have a niche of what they were going to do. Like you'd walk in there and like for instance that day I went with Brent. I kind of remember that day. I remember there was a display for Christian Death's album, The Scriptures, and I was like really turned off by that. I was still like nominally a Christian at that time, though. I didn't go to church or practice any kind of Christian rituals really. And I remember there was a Cure album. I don't remember which album it would have been now that I think about it. Maybe Kiss Me, Kiss Me, Kiss Me. I'm not sure. But I remember I kind of derided alternative rock back then still. I had kind of an ignorant attitude and I hadn't quite gotten grounded by punk rock and hardcore punk and new wave and et cetera, industrial, and all these offshoots like I did in the starting the following year and onward and kind of in vain. And I was just gradually moving more into prog rock. I mean, a lot of the stuff I got at School Kids was like Jethro Tull and King Crimson. A lot of King Crimson. That's where I discovered. So I'd already heard the first King Crimson album at school in the sound room, which is really a soundless room, and um, but they had all the John Wetton uh, fronted albums by King Crimson, the great phase, kind of phase two of King Crimson, mid '70s, and I gradually picked up all. Well, I picked up 3 out of 4 of them. Red, I later got at a place called Milestone Records. That's a place to talk about another time because I had a long history there from then on. Um, but yeah, so I went with Brennan. I saw the Black Sabbath album and I loved the cover. It was kind of like two nude lovers, strategically posed, um, painted in gold, and it was actually a reenactment of an actual sculpture called the Eternal Idol by Auguste Rodin, and um, just such a great cover, great title, and it's a great album. It was one I didn't get to listen to right away. I was so excited about it. I went into the grocery store with it in the bag instead of leaving it in Brent's car. I mean, it was cold enough to where it wouldn't have melted or warped, but I was kind of, you know, fetishizing vinyl that back then, as Frank Zappa might say. And I showed my then girlfriend. She wasn't really all that interested, but she was, nice and polite about it. And so I went home and I listened to it and I taped it as I was listening to it because I was hoping when she and I went out that night we would listen to it together. That didn't happen, unfortunately, but I did listen to it while I was taping it that afternoon. And the first track, "The Shining," kind of blew me away. It was based on the film and the book, The Shining, the basic ideas there, and some of the imagery. Um, but Tony Cat Martin, who soon dropped the cat part of his name, his voice was soaring, man, and he was very Dio-esque sounding, and I really enjoyed that. I mean, stylistically, it was carrying on from Seventh Star, and as I wrote on this countdown of all the Black Sabbath albums from my least favorite to my favorite that I posted on my blog a few years ago, Eternal Idol is really not much more than a collection of riffs, played one after the other, but what riffs they are. And that's true. I mean, they're all such incredible riffs that, you know, hooky, and but not quite as melodic as Seventh Star. Definitely not as heavy as, say, Born Again. Um, and a slightly different guitar sound Tony had on this album and the previous album than he had on, say, Heaven and Hell and Mob Rules. He was constantly kind of reinventing his sound with different effects and different techniques throughout the post Ozzy years. And um, sometimes you would hear a Black Sabbath song and not even have any clue it was Black Sabbath until the solo, because his distinctive soloing lead work was it was Tony Iommi. A little messy, some fast runs, some odd notes, and some crazy effects, and a lot of feeling, and a lot of just raw, just frenetic fretwork. And um, I think he's one of the finest guitar players to walk the earth. Electric guitar players, he's my favorite one for sure. Lead guitar players, he's my favorite one. But I really honestly think within not just the sphere of metal, but within rock and the sound he created that so many people have copied, and then he refined it, and then he changed it and experimented with it all through the years. He's just of godlike status, Tony Iommi. So I enjoyed the album. There was one or two what they would call duff tracks on it, dodgy tracks, as they might say in Kerrang magazine back then. Um, but I enjoyed the album a lot, and I didn't get to hear it that night, but I did listen to it all through the weekend. And some of the things I didn't like about it grew on me, and some didn't. Over time, but eventually the entire album, you know, became kind of like jam packed into my memory. The fact that I bought it the day it came out and was kind of like in the moment of it, much as I was with Seventh Star and like Live Evil, gave me an immediacy to it and kind of enshrined it in a special place in my memory, even though it's not in my top 10 favorite Black Sabbath albums of the 26 official albums I believe they've done. That's including live and studio, mostly studio, um, non compilations. And, it's not in my top 10, but it's certainly not in my bottom five. Um, but we're getting to those. But that was the problem. I mean, there was a freshness to it, and there was a lot of confusion with the credits because Tony basically, it was called the player, Tony Iommi, the players, and then like all these different musicians just kind of listed kind of haphazardly, more or less in order of vocals, bass, drums, keyboards, whatever. Um, and then it was like all tracks, written by Tony Iommi, or he might have even said Anthony Iommi, Um, it was a little pompous, even more so than Seventh Star, in the sense that he was going into this as a Black Sabbath album. It wasn't intended as a solo album. I mean, it was definitely Seventh Star Part Two, but he was forging a new way, and I'm not sure. Ultimately, it was a way that I don't think creatively paid off, and commercially, it really didn't pay off. Surprisingly, I guess, but maybe he was hoping would. Maybe he was just tired of playing certain kinds of material in the past. Maybe he wanted a full break. Um, I think he got spoiled working with people like Dio and Gillan and and Glenn Hughes, and wanted to have vocalists that always had this kind of soaring operatic style and were nothing like Ozzy, But again, it was his material that he was writing for these kind of vocals. It wasn't the vocalist came in and changed the whole band and ruined the band, which is a popular myth that gets thrown at Black Sabbath all the time. If someone doesn't like an album with a different lead singer, they blame that lead singer for coming in and writing new stuff and changing the direction. But that's often not the case. I mean, and that's not the case with a lot of bands. And uh, take Genesis, for instance. A lot of people, including myself, always blamed Phil Collins for ruining Genesis by him stepping out from behind the drum stool and taking up the lead vocals and more of the songwriting. Um, but it really wasn't his idea to do that initially. It was, I believe, Mike Rutherford's, the keyboardist. He wanted to go more commercial, and because they'd had a tiny taste of commercial success with Selling Eagle by the Pound and Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, which is an amazing album, best Genesis album in my opinion. Really classic. But after that, it's like, well, we're still gonna do a little prog, but man, we really need to kind of start churning out those hits. And once they got Phil going on it, that's all Phil was really capable of doing. And he wasn't well, from a money standpoint, he was insanely good at it. From a creative standpoint, aesthetic standpoint, he was, to me, the pop music he writes is some of the most banal I've ever heard in my life. I mean, surely there's more banal stuff coming out nowadays. I'm not going to deny that. But Phil Collins stuff has a very much a sameness to it that just it lingers. It lingers like a bad aftertaste in the palate. It just you just wish you had not sampled it. You know. Um, But anyway, back to Black Sabbath, which really doesn't have any overt connections that I can think of lineup wise right off the hand with Genesis. Though if you trace the Rock family trees, I'm sure there's some kind of connection. I mean, Tony Iommi was in Jethro's Hall for 2 weeks in 1969. So there's always there's always surprises along the way there. Um, Speaking of people who had a storied career being in Black Sabbath, um, things weren't working out with Dave the Beast Spitz on bass, and so Tony turned to a um, longtime sideman of Ozzy's, Bob Daisley, who played bass and also who wrote lyrics and did some back vocals in some of the bands he was in. Um, Bob Daisley played all the bass on the album and wrote all the lyrics on the album. And they're some of his coolest lyrics. They're very interesting. I mean, some of them are kind of predictable metal rock lyrics, but then some of them, like "The Eternal Idol," the song itself, or "The Shining," they're especially "The Eternal Idol" that has more exceptional lyrics, and it actually is about something, and the music is more doom sounding than anything that they had done in several albums. It was almost a harkening back to, the song Black Sabbath and the sludgy albums like Master of Reality, um, albeit with a modern kind of sound. Tony asked Bob Daisley to stay in the band, and he turned it down graciously, apparently. I went on to work some more with Ozzy, but Bob Daisley had been in, a number of bands like Widowmaker, and of course he was in Rainbow for a little bit with Ronnie James Dio. They recorded Long Live Rock and Roll and did that tour. Though Bob Daisley, I think, only appears on one song. On bass on the entire album, I think Richie Blackmore was so annoyed with Mark Clark, the bassist that he'd had and fired, that he played the bass on all the other songs on the album himself. But that's Richie there for you. Um, Bass was pretty loud, I have to say, on that album. Um, but anyway, Daisley, yeah, he came up with from Rainbow into Ozzy Osbourne's Blizzard of Oz band, and then kind of sideways, he stepped into Uriah Heep with Lee Kerslake, the drummer from Ozzy's Blizzard of Oz band, who had been a long, long time member of Uriah Heep. Uh, so the two of them became the rhythm section, but that lasted for two albums that were very commercially geared. Had some good material. I wish Bob Daisley had been allowed to write the material. There were a lot of covers on the two albums, Abominog and Head First, and you know, anyway, he left, and Trevor Bolder, who had been in David Bowie's Spiders from Mars aggregate, he came back to Uriah Heep, and I think he might even still be in Uriah. Well, he might be dead now. To be honest, I think he died not long ago. He was in Uriah Heep to the death. He was a loyal lifetime Uriah Heeper and Heapster, and so that's kind of Bob Daisley. And then he kind of moved through different session work and et cetera, et cetera. But I wish he had stayed with Black Sabbath. I think he would have been a very fitting successor for Geezer as far as being a bassist lyricist and somebody with a lot of chops and a lot of variety in his writing and his sound. He does some fretless bass stuff on Eternal Idol. It's just amazing. Um, but anyway, but the album wasn't to the level of the other albums, even Seventh Star. I mean, it it it, it was basically still kind of, I think, a half-hearted affair. Really, I think Tony's ego ran rampant, and he was kind of in interviews. He was constantly revising the history of the band and rewriting history and kind of dismissing the contributions of some people and playing up those of others in a way that wasn't particularly compatible with reality. But we're not sure how compatible Tony's brain pan was with reality at that time, because he had been so insanely prodigious with the mind altering substances for so long. Um, as one of the reasons that the Dio lineup originally fell apart. Um, Tony and Geezer were just messed up, and that's one reason Bill Ward was in and out of the band for many, many years, was because he had such a strong alcohol problem. And of course, everyone knows Ozzy's substance problems, but I mean, he never really he kind of broadcast his. That was part of his persona. It didn't really, there wasn't any kind of mystery there. And then Dio was the opposite. Dio was a heavy drinker of alcohol, and it had contributed to his stomach cancer, which ultimately killed him. Um, but he was not a drug user by most accounts. He may or may not have smoked pot once in a while. It's hard to say. Um, but it doesn't seem as though he really did anything beyond that. He seemed like he was not a narcotic or psychedelic guy, and he was hardly straight edge, but he was, I guess, the closest there was in Black Sabbath to being straight edge. So anyway, and of course Ian Gillan, he was a notorious drinker, and Glenn Hughes was a notorious, I think, heroin addict in addition to other drugs. So their whole career is laced with mind altering substances, which may or may not have impacted some of the sounds and imagery of the group. I mean, they were definitely not a pro drug band. When they did write about drugs, it seemed to be pretty anti drug, but practice what you preach. They weren't really able to do that, I guess. Um, but anyway, yeah. So the '80s waned, and who was the drummer for Black Sabbath? Eric Singer was still the drummer from Seventh Star, and his drums were getting more and more just repetitive and dull and flat. I mean, they were loud and he hit hard, but they really weren't really expressing much. I mean, they were keeping the music going, but there wasn't much of any creativity there. He's the weakest drummer that's been in Black Sabbath. Um, in fact, he's on 2 albums is amazing. But at the time, I kind of liked his sound. It was different. It's just kind of straight ahead. In hindsight, I can live with it. On those albums, but I don't think live it did not work in context. I mean, him playing a nuanced piece like percussion piece like on War Pigs, it just no, he didn't have the chops. He didn't have the desire to play that way. And so he was kind of lost in Black Sabbath. And he was obviously an aspiring big time rock star, which he later became. Because he joined Kiss for many years. Um, but on the album, he's credited as drummer, but also Bev Bevan is credited with percussion. So apparently, they were thinking of sacking singer Tony and Jeff Nichols, Naomi and Jeff Nichols. Tony Martin, I don't know if he was in quorum with them yet at that time, though he quickly became a core member. Um, they were thinking of sacking Eric, I believe, and so Bev Bevan came in, but all he did is play a little percussion on this one guitar, kind of mellow guitar track called Scarlet Pimpernel's instrumental after the infamous French anti-hero character from the French Revolution. Um, so same thing with Dave Spitz. He was credited on bass along with Bob Daisley, but by all accounts played nothing on the album. So I guess Tony was being kind of fair, and Spitz came back or wanted to come back. I understand, but it just the whole thing was a mess. I mean, keeping up with Black Sabbath at that time was just almost impossible. 1988 came and went with if I'm correct, no material. Well, no, actually, I think perhaps late 1988 the next album came out, or early '89. I kind of tend to forget. I mark it with the fact that I met this guy at college called Shannon, and we were good friends for a number of years. And Sabbath was his favorite band, and he was even more obsessive over the minutia of the stuff than I am, believe it or not. And um, we had some spirited discussions. I mean, we were usually in Congress about things. He was a little bit younger than me, so he came to Sabbath at the time post Ozzy as well, and uh, so we were kind of had that in common. But since he was younger than me, he kind of came to it right. He peaked with it a bit after Dio had left the band, and so of course he loved the Dio albums, but he loved Born Again, and that was kind of his thing, and it became my favorite album over the years. It really did, and of all their albums, um, but he was really particularly married to the Seventh Star Eternal Idol era, and then onward, he really fell in love with Tony Martin's voice, I thought Tony Martin did an amazing job on Eternal Idol. The next album started to reveal some cracks, because basically what had happened is when the album came out, which was this December 1987, was when it came out here. That's when I got it. It was originally released in November 1987. By the time it was released here, the band had already fallen apart. I mean, there were three members of Black Sabbath: Tony Iommi, Tony Martin, and Jeff Nichols, and that was it. They had no viable rhythm section. They quickly drafted in a couple of guys for some live shows. Uh, they even drafted in some guy, for to pretend to be the bass player for the video for The Shining. In the video, The Shining, the drummer is Terry Chimes, sometimes known as Tory Crimes, originally with The Clash. He was their second drummer and played on a number of their more well-known tracks. I can't remember the name of the other drummer, but he was obviously Topper Heaton. Was that him, perhaps? Uh, who was on a lot of the classic Clash. But Terry Crimes was a musician in good standing, and it was cool to see him in Black Sabbath. Uh, so they quickly got some guy named Joe Burt, and they did a number of shows. And their management was all over the place. They weren't charting anywhere. They played Sun City at the height of apartheid. I'm like, Tony, what are you thinking, man? Um, I think they played like multiple nights at Sun City. I mean, it's like, I guess, racists liked Black Sabbath too. I mean, I knew my share of Nazi skinheads in Charlotte who loved Black Sabbath, but still, that's not something you want to cater to. I mean, when your lyrics are, totally like, uh, completely leftist, and you're sitting here and you've got you're playing to these insane South African bigots. I'm probably stereotyping. That might not have been their audience there. It might have been just some average South African people. Um, Probably mostly are all white, but I'm not going to say they were all like Nazis, and they probably weren't, but still, it blemished their reputation for a few months, and with good reason. It was a very bad decision. Um, Bad optics, as they say nowadays. But Tony Martin was cool, and I have heard recordings of some of the shows, not the Sun City shows, but some of the other shows on the tour. And there's some great performances, some decent performances of the Dio material, and okay of the Ozzy material, but of the material on Seventh Star, a little bit of it, and then mostly, like half the Eternal Idol album. Uh, they acquitted themselves pretty well. I mean, Joe Burt was an unremarkable bass player, but Terry Chimes was fine. He was an improvement over Eric Singer. Um, so pushing it out a little farther, 1988 goes on, and Tony's like in a rethink of the band, and he decides he needs like some name people in the band. And so he enlists Cozy Powell, who had been in the Jeff Beck group, who had been in Rainbow. Their most best albums had Cozy Powell on drums, and a number of other bands, Whitesnake and Phenomena and Bedlam, and there's like a whole ton of Cozy Powell stuff. Michael Schenker group. I mean, this guy, he would play with anybody, could play with anybody, and you go back and you listen to his work with Jeff Beck, and you're like, man, this guy's fucking phenomenal. But then in Rainbow, he's phenomenal too, but more just the savagery of his attack and just the power of his drumming, as not so much the nuance as on the Jeff Beck stuff. And then his later material, well, like with Sabbath, his drum sound changed a good bit, and it kind of became just a power drummer, and that was disappointing to me. I was excited when I heard he was joining the band, and he and Tony Iommi and the other Tony and Jeff Nichols kind of had a strategy to basically resurrect Black Sabbath and put it back on the musical map with kind of another new incarnation. And so for bass, they enlisted not Geezer Butler, not Bob Daisley, but they enlisted, or even Dave Spitz, but they enlisted Neil Murray, who had played with Cozy Powell and Whitesnake. And by that time, Whitesnake had become a huge band globally. But right when they hit, Coverdale sacked Neil Murray, who had been his one lone long-standing member from the very beginning, like around 1976. He'd been playing with him. In 1987, that 1987 album Whitesnake got huge in 1988 and 89, and Neil Murray was kind of left out in the cold, and that was kind of shitty of David Coverdale. He wanted his own name band aggregate, and he got Rudy Sarzo, who was from Ozzy's band, on bass. It's just also incestuous. Um, but in any case, um, yeah, an album came out of this though, an album called Eternal Idol. I want to go ahead and qualify the bass thing real quick. Is that the guy who plays on the album Eternal Idol was not a full member of the band. His name was Lawrence Cottle. For years, I didn't know anything about him, and I have since learned some things about him. And I'm embarrassed to admit, as I'm kind of winging this as I go, I've kind of forgotten who he had played with previously. But it was interesting, He played some fretless bass too. Especially on the last song on this new album called Nightwing. It's very cool. Um, the album is called Headless Cross, and my friend Shannon, the fellow Sabbath fanatic, this was the first new album that came out that we bonded over. That came out during the era of our friendship, and there were several more to come, for well or ill. And um, he was crazy about it. I was skeptical. A friend who gave me a lift to college most days, Michael had played in a band that I was also in called Chiaroscuro, though we only played together like once or twice. Um, Michael was very skeptical, and he thought Sabbath had pretty much had it, and that's, I wanted to believe, I wanted to stick with it, but, to me, the test was going to be what songs did they play live and how did they sound? How did they honor the entire legacy of you know, uh, the whole history of Black Sabbath, considering that there was no Butler Ward, I mean, and it was with each album it became more glaring that there was no Butler Ward, and that's kind of rough. Um, Bill Ward did eventually come back to the group a couple of times and leave a couple of times. We'll get to that next episode probably, but I'm not going to make it to the 1992 reunion, obviously, because we're only in late 1988. So I don't want to, do a whole long hour video about all this. But um, that's kind of, I've spent a lot of time on one little era, because I guess in this era I was experiencing as it was happening. So it has a different perspective than me getting into Black Sabbath albums after the fact, like years or months or whatever after they came out originally. Um, the first album that I bought when it first came out, the week it came out, was Live Evil. So that marked the beginning of my contemporaneous enjoyment of Black Sabbath. Like I said, I did pass over Born Again rather foolishly, but I learned the error of my ways, and the Born Again tour, now you can hear a ton of footage. You can't really see any good footage of it, filmed footage. You can hear a good bit of recordings from that tour on YouTube now, and they're phenomenal. And Bev Bevan played on that tour on drums from Electric Light Orchestra. He was a longtime friend of Tony Iommi's, and it's Geezer, Bev, Tony, Ian Gillan, and Jeff Nichols. And I actually have the tour book. I forgot where I bought it. I bought it, a few years after the tour, but I still have it. I've thought about selling it, but it's a little beat up, so I probably couldn't get much out of it. So I'd rather just keep it because it's a nice memento. It has some really great photographs, not a lot of helpful information, nothing you wouldn't already know from, having the Born Again album or hearing it or knowing even a cursory amount about Black Sabbath. Nothing particularly incisive or deep there. But it was fun. It was exciting. The days when they did the giant tour books, it was about like this big, um, and maybe like 10, 20 pages tops. Mostly photos of the band, but great photos. And someday I'll scan some of those pages and put them up. Though they've all been scanned, and I have seen them on other people's sites. Um, so I'm going to wrap up now, and we'll get into a little more about Eternal Idol. I mean, I'm sorry. We'll get a little more into the Headless Cross next time, and its ensuing tour and follow-up album. Um, and hopefully I'll remember to put, speaking of sites, hopefully I'll remember to put the name of the website. The one I've been alluding to is Joel Sigler, I believe is how he says his last name, I think. His site is blacksabbath.com, but I think it's like black dash or underscore sabbath.com. It's not the official site that the band members as a corporate aggregate, which is all they survive as now. I mean, they disbanded permanently in 2017. Um, but it's not that website, but it's the top fan site, and it's the approved fan site. Now, the Osbournes may not approve of it because it doesn't, constantly fillet them, and worship everything that either of them do, meaning Ozzy and Sharon. But it is approved by Tony Iommi, Geezer Butler, Jeff Nichols, Tony Martin, Ian Gillan, whatever. Everybody's pretty much like hip to the site and has let him interview them and helped flesh out the real history of the band. And the real history of the band is much more interesting than any mythology, in my opinion. And it's very involved, and I've never been this deeply involved and entrenched in a band's many changes, many moods, and their music, and just the whole experience of a band than I have of this band. I don't know why. I have many theories, but I can't give you one concrete reason real quick why they've entranced me the way they have. But that's kind of what these videos are for, maybe to give you some idea, maybe to help me find an idea of how to express it. So I'll be back with part 5 some point within the next few days. And I've enjoyed talking. Don't know if you've enjoyed listening. I don't blame you if you haven't. This is just some wild, random stuff here that I'm throwing out to the universe. But what the hell? Pun intended. Take care. All right. I'll talk to you